There's a specific moment that happens on a solo hiking trip, usually around day 2, sometimes day 3, where the noise in your head finally goes quiet. Not silent, the trail is never silent, but the specific internal noise, the work emails, the unfinished conversations, the low-level background hum of modern life, that goes away. And what's left is just you and your footsteps and the sound of the forest and the next mile. Most hikers describe that moment as the best part of being out there. I've talked to enough people who've had stories in the Appalachians to know that the moment your head goes quiet is also the moment you start hearing things you couldn't hear before. Things the internal noise was drowning out. Tonight, 3 stories from people who went quiet on the Appalachian Trail and heard something they are still trying to make sense of. Let's go. I want to start by explaining exactly what I mean by a trail, because when I say I found a second trail running parallel to the AT, I don't mean an animal path. I don't mean a game trail or a natural corridor through the underbrush. I mean a maintained, intentional, constructed footpath, the kind that takes deliberate human effort to build and deliberate ongoing effort to keep clear. Cleared brush to a consistent width. A worn walking surface, what appeared to be a hand-dug drainage ditch along the uphill side in the steeper sections to prevent erosion. Tree blazes, not orange like the AT. These were carved, small rectangular notches cut directly into the bark at intervals, irregular spacing, maybe 60 to 100 yards apart, but consistent in their form. This was a trail that someone built and maintained and used. I just never figured out who. My name is Silas, I'm 38. I've been section hiking the AT for 7 years. I was doing a 12-day section through the Nantahala and the Smokies border area when I found it. I first noticed it on day 3, and I want to be precise about the noticing because in the first moment I wasn't sure what I was seeing. I was moving through a section of older forest, the kind where the trees are big enough that the understory is fairly open. You can see a reasonable distance between the trunks in either direction. The AT in that section runs along the side of a ridge, and about 20 feet downslope from the trail in the lower forest, I caught a glimpse of cleared ground through the trees, a line of it running in the same direction I was walking, the specific narrow linearity of a path rather than a random gap in the vegetation. I stopped, looked, convinced myself it was a drainage swale or a logging remnant, and kept walking. 20 minutes later, another glimpse of the same cleared line, same distance downslope, still running parallel. I stopped again. This time I left the AT and walked the 20 feet downslope to look directly at it. It was a trail. I stood on the AT and looked at what was 20 feet away from me. And what was 20 feet away from me was a clearly defined footpath, maybe 18 inches wide. The vegetation on both sides cut back cleanly. The surface packed and worn in the way a surface gets worn when it's regularly walked. I stepped onto it. It felt like a trail feels. Not soft forest floor, packed, solid, the specific compression of regularly traveled ground. I walked along it for maybe 100 yards, looking at the surface, looking at the sides, looking at the occasional carved notch on the trees. Everything about it was intentional and maintained. I came back up to the AT. I got out my topo map and my printed trail guide. Nothing. No trail in that corridor. No documented path. No side trail. No connector. No historical route. I took photos, photographed one of the carved notches, tried to estimate how recently the brush had been cleared by the freshness of the cut ends on the lowest branches, that the cuts hadn't weathered brown yet within the last season, I thought, possibly more recently. I got back on the AT, and as I walked for the next 2 miles, I could see it. Glimpses through the trees, the parallel line of cleared ground, running 20 feet below me, consistent, maintained, keeping pace with the main trail. I documented it as methodically as I could over the following days. Day 4, I found a section where the second trail came to within 10 feet of the AT, close enough to see the surface clearly. The surface showed foot impressions, not clear enough for detail, but the compression pattern of someone walking, not running, a regular stride, a consistent weight. Someone had walked this trail recently enough to leave impressions in the softened post-rain ground. Day 5. The second trail diverged slightly from the AT, dropping lower into the creek drainage. I lost visual contact with it for about 2 miles before picking it up again on the other side of the drainage where it climbed back to the parallel position. It had its own route logic. It was following the terrain according to its own path. It wasn't simply shadowing the AT. It was its own trail with its own routing decisions that happened to run parallel to the AT for reasons I couldn't determine. Day 6. I found something that changed the quality of the whole thing for me. A rest spot. Off the second trail, on the uphill side, a flat area cleared of debris with a log positioned horizontally at a height that someone would sit on, not a naturally fallen log. One end had been trimmed with something sharp. The cut was old, but the area around the log had been cleared recently, leaf litter removed, the ground around it swept clean. Someone sat here regularly. Someone maintained this spot specifically to sit in. I sat on the log. From where I was sitting, I had a clear sightline up to the AT. I could see approximately 100 feet of the main trail from this position. Anyone sitting here could watch the AT without being visible from it. I told myself it was a hunting setup, that someone had established a private access trail on the forest land adjacent to the AT corridor and used it for hunting access, that the rest spot was a hunting observation point, that the whole thing was explainable and legal and ordinary. I told myself that for the rest of day 6 and most of day 7. What I couldn't explain was this. I had been on that section of trail for 4 days. In 4 days on the AT, I had encountered 31 other hikers moving in both directions. I know this because I'd been logging encounters in my journal the way I always do on section trips. In 4 days, with the second trail visible from my position for probably a combined 6 or 7 miles of hiking, I had not seen a single person on it, not one. The worn surface, the cleared brush, the foot impressions in the soft ground, the maintained rest spot with its sight line to the AT, all that use, all that maintenance, and nobody on it when I was there to see. My friend Margot, a more experienced hiker than me by about 10 years, when I described this to her in detail after the trip, was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Did you ever feel watched while you were on that section?" I thought about it honestly. I said, I felt watched from day 1. I'd attributed it to solo hiker brain, the particular hyper-awareness of being alone in remote country that your nervous system produces to compensate for the absence of a partner watching your back. I'd written off every moment of it as that. She said, "The maintained rest spot with the sight line to the AT." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's not a hunting setup." I said, "Now I know." She said, "Hunters build setups facing into the forest, away from trails, away from people." I said, "I know." A silence. She said, "Someone built that to watch the AT." I said, "For how long?" She said, "Based on the trail age and the infrastructure, a long time. Based on the cleared debris and the fresh cut ends on the brush, recently too." I said, "Why would someone build 6 miles of maintained trail to watch the AT?" She said, "I don't know. Neither do I. I've contacted the Forest Service about it. I gave them my photos, my GPS coordinates of the sections I documented, my descriptions of the carved notches, and the rest spot. They told me they'd look into it. That was 14 months ago. I haven't heard back. I still think about the rest spot, the log positioned at sitting height, the sight line to the main trail, the cleared debris that told me someone had been there recently. I think about the 31 hikers I encountered over 4 days on the AT. I think about how many of them stopped at that section, took their pack off, ate their lunch, looking out at the view, looked out at the view without knowing there was something 20 feet downslope looking back at them. I want to be upfront about my skepticism here, because I'm the kind of person who, when I tell this story, prefaces it with, I know how this sounds and I know what the rational explanations are, and I've run through all of them, and none of them fully work. I'm an engineer by training. I think in systems and logic, and I have done so for 20 years. I am not prone to mystical thinking, and I am not a person who frightens easily. And I am also a person who, on a Tuesday afternoon in September 3 years ago, had a conversation with a voice on the Appalachian Trail in Virginia that knew something and had no way of knowing. I've accepted that both of those things are true. It took a while. My name's Broderick. Most people call me Brody. I'm 44. I've been section hiking for 5 years. The Virginia section was my 4th serious trip. Day 3 of a 7-day solo section, good conditions, the kind of September hiking in the Virginia highlands that feels like the mountains are rewarding you for showing up. I was moving well, making good miles, in the quiet headspace that comes when you've been out long enough to shed everything that isn't the trail. Around 2 p.m., I was on a ridge section, exposed, light wind, moving through a series of rocky outcrops that required occasional hands and feet scrambling. I heard a voice. Behind me, a reasonable distance back, a male voice, conversational tone, the kind of volume that carries on a quiet trail. He said, "That section with the loose scree about a mile ahead, stay left at the cairn." I stopped, turned around. Nobody on the trail behind me, as far as I could see, which was a good distance on that exposed ridge. Several hundred feet of clear sightline. I looked ahead, nobody in front either. I called back, hello, nothing. I stood for a moment, decided I'd misheard. A trick of wind over rock. Sound carrying from somewhere I couldn't locate the source. I kept walking. About a mile further, a cairn, and beyond it, a section of trail that crossed a talus slope. On the right side of the cairn, the trail crossed the slope directly. On the left side, a detour path went slightly around the worst of the loose rock. I stayed left, as the voice had said, and picked my way across without incident. When I reached the other side, I looked back at the direct route. The scree on that section was genuinely loose. Large, flat stones shifted visibly under my weight when I tested one edge of it. The kind of surface that would be a rolled ankle or worse with a full pack. The voice had been right, about something I hadn't encountered yet, from behind me, on an empty trail. I camped that night with the obvious practical explanation comfortably installed. A hiker ahead of me on the trail who'd come back, or a hiker moving faster than me who'd passed while I'd been off trail for water, someone who knew this section well and offered a local tip. I made peace with it. Day 4, mid-morning. The voice again, this time closer, beside me almost, the specific spatial quality of someone walking at the same pace just off my right shoulder. He said, "The shelter at mile marker 842 has a water issue, spring's dry, don't count on it." I stopped, turned right, nothing, turned fully around, empty trail. I stood in the middle of a wide exposed section of trail where I had clear sight in every direction for several hundred feet. Nobody, no movement in the trees on either side, no sound of footsteps receding. I was alone. I'll tell you what I did with this information, because it's the part that tells you how seriously I took it, even while I was telling myself I didn't. I rationed my water more carefully for the rest of that day. I filled at every reliable source I passed. When I reached mile marker 842 inches the late afternoon, the spring was dry. A small sign someone had left on a stick said, "Spring low, check at shelter." At the shelter, the water report in the logbook confirmed that the spring had been unreliable for 2 weeks. Every entry for the past 2 weeks mentioned carrying extra water into that section. Information that was in a logbook at a shelter I hadn't reached yet, that the voice knew on a trail section I hadn't covered yet. Ahead of me, from beside my right shoulder. Day 5, I decided to try something. I know this was not my most rational moment. I want to be honest about that. But I'd had 2 accurate pieces of information from a source I couldn't explain. And I wanted to know what would happen if I acknowledged it directly. I was on a forested section, no wind, good acoustics between the trees. I said out loud, not loudly, but clearly, toward my right side where both previous instances had seemed to come from. "If you're there, is there anything else I should know?" I felt stupid immediately. The forest was quiet. I kept walking. About 40 minutes later, from behind me, a normal conversational distance. "The ridge on day 6 has weather coming. Don't push for the summit." I stopped. I said, "Hello?" Nothing. I said, "Who's there?" Nothing. I stood on that trail for probably 3 full minutes, watching both directions, listening to the forest around me. No footsteps, no movement, no person. I walked the rest of the day with the specific careful attention of someone who has decided to take something seriously even without a framework for why. Day 6, the ridge. By early afternoon, clouds had moved in faster than the morning's forecast suggested. The wind had come up. By 2 p.m., I was watching genuine storm development to the west. The specific purple-gray stacking of a system with teeth I had been planning to push for the summit and camp on the exposed section above tree line. I did not push for the summit. I dropped below tree line, found a sheltered site in the trees, set up before the rain hit. The storm that came in that evening was the most significant weather event of my entire trip. Sustained wind, horizontal rain, temperature drop of 20 degrees. Exactly what you do not want to be above tree line in. 3 hikers I met the following morning had caught the edge of it on the ridge. One had a tent pole failure. One had spent 4 hours in emergency bivouac. Nobody was injured. Everybody was okay. But I haven't told many people this story, not because I think they won't believe me, but because I don't fully know what I'm asking them to believe. I don't know what the voice was. I don't know whether it was something in the mountain, some quality of that specific terrain that carries sound from ahead of you backward to your position in ways that physics doesn't usually allow, or something else, something older, something that has been on those ridges longer than the trail has. What I know is that it was accurate. Every piece of information it gave me was accurate. The scree on the left, the dry spring, the weather on day 6. And here is the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that sits with me more than the unexplained nature of the source. It was helpful. Whatever was speaking to me on that trail, whatever it was trying to keep me safe. And I don't know what to make of a thing that I can't explain and can't locate and can't see. That spent 3 days making sure I got off that mountain in one piece. I've gone back to that section once since, different season, earlier in the year. I listened for the voice the whole time. I didn't hear it. Hey, real quick, before story 3, if tonight's the first time you found this channel, welcome, and hit subscribe right now, because every week there are more of these. Real stories, real people, real things that happened in places like the Appalachians that don't fit any clean explanation. Drop a comment, tell me whether you would have listened to that voice or kept walking, because story 3 is about something found deep off trail that someone had been returning to for a very long time. I should tell you what drew me to the site in the first place, because it wasn't random. I wasn't simply wandering off trail. I'd done research. I'd found the reference in a county historical archive. A brief mention of a homestead family who'd lived in the Appalachian interior of western North Carolina in the early 1900s and whose land had eventually been absorbed into the national forest. The archive had a hand-drawn map, rough, old, the kind of sketch a surveyor or county assessor made, and it showed the approximate location of the homestead relative to a ridgeline I recognized from hiking the area. I wanted to find it the way you want to find any piece of history that's been absorbed back into the landscape. The desire to put your hand on a stone wall and feel the connection to people who built something in a hard place a century ago. That's what I was doing out there, finding history. What I found was more than that. My name is Paulina. I'm 37. My husband Fen knows the Appalachian interior of North Carolina better than anyone I've ever met. He was going to come, but had a work conflict. I went alone, which in retrospect I'm glad about, because I'm not sure I'd have reacted the same way with him there. I think I'd have minimized it, pretended it was less than it was. Alone, I couldn't minimize it. The site was about 1.5 miles off the main trail, navigating by the archive map and a compass bearing, through a section of mature forest that hadn't seen regular foot traffic in a long time. The underbrush was dense in places, the terrain rising and falling, no path. I found the foundation in a small clearing, a flat area on the east side of a ridge where someone had once built a life. The foundation stones were Appalachian fieldstone, the kind you find everywhere in that country, large, flat gray stones laid in courses to form the perimeter of what had been a small structure, a cabin, maybe 20 by 20 feet, the corners still recognizable, the interior space open to the sky, a century of weather and vegetation. The stones were covered in moss in the shaded sections. Small trees had grown up through the interior. It was the kind of ruin that reads as old immediately. And then I saw the cleared area inside the foundation perimeter in the section of the interior that would have been near the northwest corner of the original structure. Someone had cleared the ground. Not the whole interior, just that corner, roughly an 8-foot square. The leaf litter removed, the small plants pulled back, the ground raked or swept to bare earth. And on the bare earth, arranged with deliberate care, a collection of objects. I want to describe them precisely because the precision is important. Several smooth creek stones placed in a rough circle, river washed, different sizes, the kind you'd gather specifically rather than find at the site. 3 small bundles of dried plant material tied with what appeared to be natural fiber. I recognized one as dried mountain laurel, the others I couldn't identify. Set at points within the stone circle, a piece of antler, a small section placed at the top of the arrangement, and in the center, a glass jar sealed, containing what appeared to be earth or ash. I couldn't tell which without opening it, and I didn't open it. The arrangement was deliberate. It had the intentionality of something made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why, and it was fresh. I want to be specific about how I knew it was fresh, because this is where the research instinct in me became useful. The dried plant bundles had not weathered. Their color was still the pale gold of recently dried material. If they'd been outside for more than a few weeks in that climate, the moisture would have darkened them and the binding fiber would have started to degrade. The creek stones had been placed recently enough that the disturbed earth around their bases hadn't settled, the edges of each placement still slightly raised. The cleared ground itself, the raked bare earth, had no new leaf fall on it, and the trees around the site were actively dropping. I could hear individual leaves coming down in the still air around me while I stood there, and the cleared area was bare. This had been tended within the last few days. Someone had been here within the last few days. In a location 1.5 miles off any trail, accessible only by off-trail navigation, at a homestead site that appeared in a county archive that most people had probably never looked at. I stood in that foundation for a long time, not touching anything, not disturbing anything, just looking. I photographed everything methodically from multiple angles, the same documentation instinct I'd used all my professional life. And then I looked more carefully at the foundation walls themselves. The stones were old, that was clear. But in several places, on the interior faces of the foundation courses, there were marks, small marks, carved, the kind of thing you only see if you're looking closely. Not initials, not dates. The same kind of angular, deliberate symbols I'd seen in my folklore research. Protective marks, the kind documented in Appalachian folk tradition. Some of them clearly old. The edges of the carved lines, rounded and softened by weathering. Some of them clearly recent, sharp edges, pale fresh stone, carved within months rather than decades. Someone had been maintaining the marks on these stones, the same way someone had been maintaining the arrangement in the corner, returning to this site, this specific ruined foundation in a clearing 1.5 miles off any trail, and tending it regularly for what appeared to be a very long time. I want to tell you about Veda, because Veda is the part of this story that I think about the most. Veda is an elderly woman in the nearest small town. The town is about 12 miles from the trailhead. She's been there her whole life. She's in her late 80s. Her family goes back in that county for generations. I found her through the local historical society. I went with my photographs, wanting to understand what I'd found. She looked at the photographs for a long time. Then she said, "You went to the Harmon place." I said, "Is that what the family was called?" She said they were there a long time before the Forest Service took it. The last of them left in the 1,940 seconds. I said, "Do you know who's been going back to the site?" The arrangement in the foundation, the marks on the stones, they're recent. She looked at me. She said, "It's been tended as long as I can remember." I said, "By whom?" She said, "Different people over the years." people who understand what it's for. I said, what is it for? She said, the foundation sits on a place in the land that has always needed attending to. Before the Harmons built on it, before any European family was in those mountains, that spot was known. The family that built there. They learned what it was when they arrived, and they kept up the practice. I said, what happens if it isn't kept up? She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, have you ever noticed that there are places in a forest that animals avoid? Places where the birds don't land and the deer don't browse and even the insects seem thin? I said, yes. She said, something in the ground there requires management. The foundation marks and the arrangement are the management. I said, management of what? She said, something that has been in that ground for a very long time that doesn't belong in this one. I've been back to the site twice since, not to disturb anything, to observe, to document whether the arrangement is maintained. It is. Each time I visited, the clearing has been freshly tended, the dried plant bundles replaced, the stones releveled, the marks on the foundation refreshed where weather has softened them. I have never once, across 3 visits in 18 months, seen anyone at the site, the same way I never saw anyone on the second trail Silas described, the same way Brody never located the source of the voice. Here is what I think about when I think about that foundation in its clearing in the North Carolina mountains. Someone has been going there for a very long time, longer than any one person's lifetime, different hands over the generations, maintaining an arrangement in an old ruin that most people will never find, keeping something managed, keeping something in. And I think about the fact that I went out there alone with a archive map and a compass bearing, and I stood in that foundation for 40 minutes, and I didn't know what the marks meant or what the arrangement was for. I think about Veda saying, something in the ground there requires management. And I think about the fact that I was alone in that clearing for 40 minutes with no knowledge of what I was standing in the middle of, and whatever is in that ground was 2 feet below my feet. And I didn't know to be careful. And I don't know whether that matters. I don't know whether being careful would have made any difference at all. 3 things the Appalachians gave us tonight: a trail running parallel to the one everyone walks, maintained and used by no one visible, watched from a rest spot, no map records, a voice on a ridge that knew the trail ahead of you, that kept you out of the bad scree and away from the dry spring and below tree line on the night the storm came, and a foundation in a clearing that someone has been returning to for generations, tending something, managing something, keeping something in. What those 3 things share, and it's the thing I keep landing on after a night like this, is maintenance. The parallel trail was maintained. The voice maintained you, kept you intact, got you off the mountain. The foundation has been maintained across lifetimes. The Appalachians require attention, not your admiration, not your fear, your attention. The people who have lived in those mountains the longest have always known this. The families who built on difficult land and learned what it meant to build there. The people who kept up the marks and the arrangements and the practices that most of the modern world has decided was superstition. It wasn't superstition. It was maintenance, and the trail keeps going, whether you're on it or not. And something is walking it. Good night.